This episode is dedicated to Marcus Powell, Jet Cloud, and Lisa for becoming our newest Southpaw supporters and helping to make this project possible.
This is Sam.
This is Team Southpaw.
And this is Fight Study.
Team Southpaw is back once again, this time to discuss UFC 259, Blachowicz versus Adesanya, which also featured two other title fights. We had to get the band back together for this one because beyond just the fights, there were so many other things that needed proper commentary, like the UFC commentary itself. If you hated the commentary, listening to us will be food for your soul. And if you didn't listen to our last fight panel discussion on Fight Study 87, Overeem versus Volkov, Team Southpaw are just members of our Discord chat server. So instead of the hierarchy of, this is me and Paul and y'all listen to us, the panel is a chance for the Southpaw community to also give their takes, because their takes are just as valid. If you don't know what Discord is, it's a popular chat platform that first started for gamers, but now it's basically the most popular place for leftists to chat on. Because unlike social media platforms, conversations here are all real time, just like you would have in real life, except it's all private and encrypted. How you gain access to our Discord is by becoming a monthly subscriber on Patreon. We do a live discussion during every UFC event. If you follow us, you're already saying you're a conscientious MMA fan. Then, for your own mental health, you'd much rather be watching the UFC cards with us than anyone else. Also on our Discord, we do a lot of discussions on left theory from a martial arts perspective, which might draw different conclusions than you're used to. Remember, for us, it has to be theory from the gym out into the world. It will make zero sense for our project to have one set of politics for the world and a different one for the gym, which I find is the default for most leftists who train martial arts. But this creates a lot of problems and contradictions. Ultimately, how you do one thing is how you do all things, because you're reinforcing habits and ideas. Even if you organize every weekend, if you train, you'll be in the training world much more often than in any action. So what habits and ideas are you reinforcing? This doesn't occur to even leftists who train martial arts because this is not part of the left discourse, nor are there books written about this. However, this is what Southpaw is all about. This is the void Southpaw is filling. There is a world of difference between a leftist who happens to train martial arts and a leftist martial artist. Namely, are you in contradiction or consistent? Are you reactionary half the time? Are you in the real world trying to apply ideas that wouldn't even work in the small microcosm of the gym? Are you against all structures, which would include a gym or any organized training collective with instructors, while simultaneously training and benefiting from a gym or collective? With all of the explaining out of the way, let's introduce the panel. Karyan, Alexander, Aaron, and New Guy. Let's start with the first prelim fight of the night, Kai Kara-France versus Hygerio Bonterin, with Kara-France winning by KO at 4:55 of the very first round. The stoppage itself was very confusing, which is becoming all too common with Herb the Herb Dean. Let's start with Aaron, since this is his first fight panel. What are your thoughts about this fight?
I thought it was kind of interesting at the start, especially just Kai Kara-France, his reactions whenever, I'm going to butcher pronunciations, Hygerio was going at him, because he just sort of shell up, wouldn't see anything, and then he'd sort of exit out. He'd try to exit out, and that's how he got the takedown, because he just timed that. And then the grappling stuff, he was just struggling to survive. I'm not a grappler, so I don't. It just looked like he was struggling to survive. That's why even Rogan said at the time, like, it just looks like he's treading water, which he then flipped in the post-fight conference to say phenomenal defense for some reason. But then at the end, once he ended up getting up, it just looked like he was desperate. He just really didn't want a 10-8 round. Kai Kara-France didn't. And so he just tried to pour all of it on. What I really liked when he caught him with that right a little bit, and then he had stuck his jab out, held it out there, so he could guide his uppercut, which is the thing that ended the fight. Well, sort of ended the fight, because then Herb Dean didn't call the fight off, which is just been a problem for Herb. He just hasn't been dotting his I's and crossing his T's for a little while now. So that's why it led to all that confusion right at the end, where Kara France obviously didn't think the fight was ended, went to punch him again, and it was just weird.
That has happened in fights before where the ref is like, the fight's not over, come over here and hit the guy a couple of more times.
Yeah, exactly. And you could tell that's what Kai thought was happening. Which is also then confusing why Joe and DC were just confused for like 2 minutes for no real reason. It's like, it's pretty obvious what just happened. It was a weird fight.
Well, the fight wasn't weird. The fight was good with ups and downs and drama. It was just the ending was weird.
Yeah.
It was pretty like binary. It was like one person was winning and then clearly another person was winning. And then the end was that mess. I think the confusion is because once the referee grabs you, then you're supposed to stop. But then once the referee waves his hand is when the fight is over. And Herb, being a Herb, grabbed him, but did not wave his hands. And that's where the confusion started until I think eventually he just said the fight is over, or he made some signal for that.
It was also him just because he was just hovering over Hygerio at the end. He wasn't like knelt down trying to like, hold him or anything like that. Like you often see when someone's been knocked out and the fight is over, the ref is often holding the knocked out opponent. But he was just kind of hovering over him like he would if the fight was continuing.
Yeah, normally as soon as it's over because of a stoppage like that, the referee will ask for the doors to be open and call the doctor in. And instead, he's just kind of like, are you okay? Do you need a minute? Do you want to continue? It's one of those things. Alexander?
I felt bad for Bonterin, quite honestly, just because he was doing so well. It was going his way, and he wasn't getting a finish. But you're like, you know what? This is a good sign. This is a good sign. Things are looking great going forward. Everything's coming up Bonterin, and then all of a sudden, they get up, and it stops going his way. And it just has me thinking about. I think we talk a lot about like the baseline level of grappling defense that is necessary to survive a fight, which Kara France was like demonstrating. Is like, hey, I cannot get choked out for long enough to get up. But we didn't see the same level of like basic striking defense from Bonterin when it got back to the field. Because, it ended pretty quickly once it got back up.
Karian, what happened on the ground? Because it looked like it was case closed and the fight was over. And then it wasn't. And I think the ending was something none of us expected because we just thought, either he's going to have him wrapped up until the round ends or he's going to finish him.
Yeah. So the way it got to the ground was actually very impressive because Hygerio, like Bonterin, he was just so quick to get to the back off of that takedown that once it was on the ground, he was immediately on the back. But Kara France was so patient. And they also, even though, Hygerio was on the back, they were kind of up against the cage and tilted at a weird angle where Hygerio's choking hand was kind of going towards the fence, and he was also going down towards the ground. Usually when you try to get a rear naked choke, you don't want to be choking towards the ground. You want to be choking towards the ceiling. It's a lot harder to finish guys like that. And with the defense on top of that difficulty and the fence, he wasn't getting that choke. He did try to turn him away. But once he turned him away, Kara France was just already defending super well, getting to the hands. I noticed that the grip Hygerio was using, it was, he was trying to go like kind of palm to palm and tuck like his forearm down beneath Kara France's shoulder. He wasn't ever really able to hide his choking hand. Kara was just managing to get to the wrist, get to the hand, hold on to the hand, and peel it back off. and managed to spin out of the back control and get back to his feet eventually. Like Alexander mentioned, that's, basic defense to be able to get into a bad position that quickly and still remain patient, committed to your defense, know that if you keep their hand, they can't choke you. If you're in that position where they have your back, but you're on top and you're leaning on them, they can't really strike you effectively either. So the only thing they have is the choke. Once someone spins out of that and they get back up to their feet, you kind of have to either keep chasing the grappling or let them back up. I definitely feel like Bonterin could have made a much better choice by, instead of going for the choke, trying to transition out to mount or something like that. But yeah, as soon as the separation came, the striking was way different. The uppercut planted him on his face, and that was definitely a clean, should have been stopped. With Herb, that was kind of insane, because not only did he touch khara France, he didn't wave his hands after. He just kind of looked at Hygerio on the ground, almost like he was offering him like some water. Like, didn't touch him, didn't tell him the fight was over. And then once he noticed khara France was coming back to hit him, he like just kind of shoulder checked khara France and then was like, okay, it's done.
It seemed like he got lost in a thought or something, All of a sudden, everything slowed down and like some AM Gold kind of music comes on. And he's just having a moment where he's like having an internal monologue about like, why am I here? What am I doing? Why am I a referee? And then he sees khara France running to hit Bonterin, and he's like, oh, wait a minute. I know where I'm at. I'm in the octagon. I'm refereeing a fight. Oh, I got to protect people's lives. So
why am I a referee?
A lot of us are asking that very question about him lately.
I think he got confused by khara walking off like he did. Like, it looked like he was just like, oh, Kai knows the fight's over, so I don't have to do anything. And then he was like, cool, the fight's over. I don't have to be a ref anymore. And then was like, oh, wait, like, I have to do things.
My own take about the fight is a lot of the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guys who come over and transition to MMA, they're thinking, okay, I already have grappling skills. I'm just going to add to that some striking skills. And then on top of that, some takedown skills. So they get very good at taking down, and from the takedown, chaining it into submission grappling. So instantly from the takedown, taking the back. They're really good at that. What they're lacking is what wrestlers are really good at, which is they come from wrestling and they add on to that submissions and striking. So then once they take somebody down, they try to do submissions or do positional control. But once they feel the person is getting up, they're really good at going back to wrestling and chaining wrestling and getting the person back down. And that's something BJJ guys are really lacking, is once it hits the ground, they're just on jiu-jitsu mode. So they go from wrestling to jiu-jitsu, but they're not good at going from jiu-jitsu back into wrestling. I see that's one problem. They're better at taking the back from the takedown, much better than a lot of the wrestlers, but they can't get their person back to the ground as soon as that happens. And another aspect, going back to talking about wrestling and trying to finish that rear naked choke, is he was so tunnel vision on the finish on the rear naked choke that, unlike wrestlers, he didn't use the back control as a position to land strikes. A lot of the submission guys, the jiu-jitsu guys, just keep chasing the neck and they're not hitting their opponent. You'll see a lot of wrestlers even like not go for the back oftentimes because they want to tire out their opponent first, or they want to hit them more, because once they commit to the back, they're committed to the back. Dominick Cruz, for example, has never taken the back. And then once they do take the back, they don't necessarily hyper-focus on the finish. They're like, I'm going to ground and pound from here as well. And then I'm going to mount them if they spin. And then from the mount, try to do a mat return if they try to get back up. So I feel like you really need that high-level chain wrestling at this point, and also the ability to finish it on the feet if you need to, or at least be respectable enough on the feet where you can lead to more takedowns. Which actually, the next fight we're going to talk about is a good example of, because we have Askarov versus Joseph Benavidez, with Askarov winning a dominant unanimous decision. And also another note about Askarov, he's one of the few UFC fighters who is deaf. The other famous one being Matt Hamill. So, Karyan, give us your thoughts on this fight and this performance and what Askarov looks like in the division and what Joseph Benavidez looks like in the division.
Yeah, this one, it was kind of hard for me to get as good of a read on this one as I really wanted to, even having watched it twice before coming to this panel, just because nothing really stood out to me. Like, about Joseph Benavidez, a lot of people were saying that he looked extra awkward, his striking looked really bad and stuff. And he did seem like, not super comfortable, but he didn't look like terrible. It was just kind of a case of Askarov looking so much better and, really on the rise at the time that Benavidez is on his decline, that it's like the perfect meeting of, he's just going to keep getting better, and Benavidez now is seeing a decline in his, skills he had already developed, and he's going to have to either add new layers or, come up with a different strategy that works better for him in his later career. Asgar was landing some really nice, front body kicks that were landing pretty hard. Anytime that, the two met on the feet, it seemed like he was landing pretty much cleaner than Benavidez, but then also chaining it straight into really great takedowns as well. 125 is one of those divisions where pretty much anything 155 and under, I think anyone in the top 10 fighting anyone else in the top 10 is going to be a good fight and could potentially be a championship fight.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because watching this, it's clear that Joseph Benavidez is still very competitive. It's just that anything below 155, a fighter with this talent is going to have a hard time. But with this same talent, at 155 and above, they could probably still stick around in the top 5 or even make another title run. It just speaks to how anything at the lower weight classes is so competitive. So he's still very good. He's still very competitive. It's just that the division is full of even more competitive fighters these days. And I think Benavidez looked even worse in the striking because Askarov, his takedown and wrestling dominance was so good that Joseph kept worrying about the takedowns, because I think everybody else Joseph fought, even Dominick Cruz, they weren't mat wrestling like Askarov was, or a lot of these newer European fighters are, which is to not just hold you statically or chain wrestle takedowns, but they're constantly breaking you down and doing different types of rides and going from one ride to another ride to another ride, keeping you on the ground, keeping you pinned. I don't think he's used to that because really until Khabib Nurmagomedov showed up, we hadn't seen that before, even from the Olympic level wrestlers, because the Olympic level wrestlers we were used to were Americans and they had a different style than the Eastern Europeans. So this was something Benavidez wasn't ever used to. And I don't think he has anybody to replicate that. Another example of how bad Rogan is at commentating is during this fight, he kept talking about Askarov's front kick and he kept saying how unique it was because he's like, I've never seen anybody do front kicks with their front leg. And it's like, what? First of all, most people do that. And secondly, whether it's in Muay Thai or even in karate or taekwondo, a lot of times you are taught to use the front leg for the front kick as your jab, your rangefinder, and the thing that creates distance. Using the rear leg, which in pro wrestling is called the Yakuza kick, is just kind of more of a preference for people who have a certain type of personality. But that isn't pedagogy. That isn't the standard way, especially in Muay Thai. So it shows how little Joe Rogan knows even about striking if he thinks front leg front kicks are weird. The reason why it's called the Yakuza kick is because it's saying only the most aggro, gangsterish types of fighters use the rear leg, right? 300, this is Sparta. But I guess that also speaks to his whole shtick about being alpha and aggro and testosterone. He's like, oh, wait, the aggro way isn't the standard?
Someone show him Hoist Gracie teeping with the lead leg in UFC 1, please.
Yeah.
Or just mention tape.
Yeah, just say teep.
Yeah.
And then he'd be like, oh yeah, that makes sense.
Next, we have Kyler Phillips versus Song Yadong, with Phillips winning by unanimous decision. Phillips was actually a tough contestant and also an early Contender Series fighter. but he didn't get signed, and it took him a couple of years in LFA to get an actual UFC contract. So it's actually been a long journey for him to become a UFC prospect. Aaron?
I just think this was just a really good game plan by Kyler Phillips coming in and good execution. Because he had a really active guard whenever Song Yadong was coming in. He was kind of blocking it with his guard. And he just was really bouncy because he was a bit faster than Song and a bit longer. So he would stick out at range, then he'd just bounce in with straight punches, 1-2, maybe a hook in there, and then bounce back out. And so he was just constantly getting the better of all the exchanges for the most part in the first few rounds. But Song was hitting him with some rear uppercuts because he was leaning forward a bit. Kyler was leaning forward. But it was just a good game plan, especially the takedowns at the end of the rounds, where I don't think it looks like on the rewatch, I don't think Kyler particularly cared about necessarily trying to finish him on the ground. But it was just I've been striking a lot. He's expecting a lot of strikes. I'll sort of fake coming in and then I'll take you down, and that will secure the round, or both those first two rounds. But Song was making some really nice adjustments throughout, where he was starting to time Kyler, slipping a bit better, and hooking. It was just taking a bit too long for Song to kind of catch up to what Kyler was doing.
I don't think they ever talked about any of Yadong's uppercut. Like, Phillips was landing a lot, but the times that he missed, Yadong would capitalize with that uppercut. But for whatever reason, they saw it. Did you notice that they saw it as Phillips landing, and they didn't even mention the uppercut?
Yeah, it's that whole problem that Joe's always had, where he finds a narrative really early on, and then he just sticks throughout the fight.
That's how he is with everything. That's the whole thing about his podcast.
But they just didn't give Song his due when he was hitting, because when he wasn't hitting as much, but he was hitting harder because he hits like a truck. There was a couple of times, there was two in particular rear uppercuts that Song hit Kyler with that you could see affected Kyler, but they just didn't really mention it.
The way Yadong was landing it was Kyler would come in with the 1-2 and he would time it and slip and then come back with the uppercut. So that was a nice bit of technique. It looked like Yadong's real problem was that he started cage cutting way too late in the fight and didn't mix it up. He was just headhunting too much.
Actually, something that Kyler did that was kind of bad was, especially in the third round, he tried to clinch with Song twice, like a sort of Muay Thai clinch. He behind both hands behind Song's head, and Song just let loose. He just got 4 or 5 heavy punches in, and it forced Kyler to let go and back up.
Karyan?
Yeah, this was a really good fight. I mean, it's bantamweight, so I rarely see a fight that I'm unhappy with in the weight class. Song Yadong did one of the things I really loved, which was changing the right uppercut to the head to a right uppercut to the body. I saw Kyler take a breath and then be like, okay, I'm going to shoot. And he would shoot for the takedown immediately. I think it was one of those things where, like we said, Song just took a little while to get to the cage cutting and should have probably invested more in the body. It's just one of those fights where, yeah, this is 135. This looked great. Kyler looked amazing. Song looked amazing. With the very first Kyler Phillips takedown, I think I posted in the chat, Song Yadong school of just get up. Because he, stiff-armed the head, popped up on a hip, and Kyler reshot on the takedown, got him down again, and then Song just did it twice in a row and got straight up. It was insane.
Yeah, it looked like Yadong with a different game plan could definitely win this, but I think also, especially with the language barrier, it's hard for him to follow the advice he gets in the corner, because it has to be translated.
Yeah, I think that's one thing commentary did notice that was, one good thing is someone being like, how does Song Yadong hear people yell at him in 2 languages and still go out and fight?
Yeah, I think he's not somebody who's really great at adapting on his own. And so he needs a good coach and a corner, but at the same time, he has the language problems, which then becomes more chaotic, which then has him fight what looks like a confused fight. I've seen him do that. Even sometimes when he wins a split decision, it got that close because he was fighting so confused and he couldn't stick to the stuff that was working well for him until the very end when he finally put it together, or maybe finally they were able to get through to him. This is what you need to do to win. So I think that might become an ongoing problem with them. Now, what did y'all think about Kyler Phillips' weird post-fight speech, like about motivation and you can do it and all that?
Yeah, he just talked about, like, so long as you can breathe oxygen and so long as you have limbs, and then you always have a chance and you can just fight. And it was just, it was this really strange, like, I don't know, like motivational posters on Instagram. Like, I imagine his Instagram feed is just filled with all of those sort of positive affirmation, kind of self-fulfilling crap that's everywhere. I likened it in the chat to James Ellsworth in wrestling, where he was jokingly, when he was fighting Braun Strowman, was like, "Oh, I think any man with two hands has a fighting chance." That's kind of what it sounded like. That's sincere. It was just really weird. It was like, hey, you just soundly beat one of the best guys in your division, and you don't want to hype yourself up, or you just want to be a weird motivational speaker.
At first, I thought he was talking about his own performance because he was the underdog, but then you realize, no, he's using this as a metaphor that all of us, we can all achieve whatever we want in life, so long as we're breathing and we have limbs. Like, there's nothing stopping us, right? Because at the end, he made it clear, no, this is what I want to tell the audience. This isn't for me or what I overcame. This is for all of you, that you can all follow your dreams and make your dreams a reality.
Because this is where I look for motivation in life. Fighters, post-fight interviews.
This really just kind of felt to me like I literally looked down at my phone and kind of tuned a lot of it out, because it felt like one of those things where, a jiu-jitsu coach that's way too hyped about my performance, like in a tournament on the way home, is like, see, this is why, nothing's ever going to hold you down. You could do whatever. Like, you'll be fine. You could go to college. Like, you could do whatever you want. You could be president. And it's like, man, I just didn't tap to like a bow and arrow. That's it. That's all it was. I just want to go home. Just want to play video games. It's fine.
This actually explains, though, how the mat creates libertarian politics, because they'll take that example and then apply it to the world, and they think, oh, okay, it's all bootstraps. Whatever you want, right? It's like that Luke Rockhold thing. If you see it, believe it, you become it. This is how it happens, folks. You wonder how the mat, how BJJ, how MMA, how combat sports leads to far-right libertarian politics. This is how it happens. They take some kind of motivation to feel good about themselves to win a fight, and then they take it to heart, literally, and then apply it to everything.
You can especially see, because it's the same disconnect that a lot of libertarians and the right have with the world, because presumably Kyler, with his team for however many weeks, they trained together, they devised a good game plan, and it ended up working, and he had good coaching from the corner. Like, it was a nice team effort for him to win, where they built from solid foundations. And then at the end, he's just saying, yeah, you just got to breathe air and have limbs, and then you can do whatever you want.
And it's not a team effort. It's all on you.
Exactly. It's all just individual force of will. Like, it's adjacent to that whole grind culture. Like, you just got to put your nose down and do it.
Which sounds good and feels good when it works, right? When you win. And this is the problem with libertarian ideas, is a lot of times it doesn't work, and you only think about the times it does work, right? And then you universalize that. But Phillips has lost before. I mean, he didn't even get signed after The Ultimate Fighter. And on top of that, yeah, he came off like a goofball on that show as well. So yeah, you won this time, so it feels like this, but your formula or your system doesn't work. Like, there's evidence it doesn't work, because there's often times it doesn't work. There's oftentimes you lose. There's oftentimes where people don't succeed. So then what? Like, what about that evidence, right? So there's a lot of magical thinking that goes along with this, which, if you want to fight, you're so nervous, you need magical thinking. It has nothing to do with being factual. It has everything to do with being nervous and telling yourself whatever you need to get over that nervousness. Next, we have the prelim headliner, bantamweight GOAT Dominick Cruz versus Casey Kenny, with Cruz beating Kenny by split decision. Let's save his post-fight speech for the very end. New guy, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so this fight was a huge question for me, just because obviously Dominick Cruz has had so many layoffs, the results of his last two fights, And also, it was just a question about where Casey Kenny stands as a prospect in the division. But, Dominick Cruz came out, impressed everyone, showed that sort of his specific style of movement still hasn't really been just completely figured out by everyone in the sport. And he took it home.
Aaron?
Cruz's footwork and his awkward style, you could tell that it was mentally wearing on Casey as the fight drew on, because obviously Cruz sort of famously doesn't hit that hard. He's much more about volume. But Casey was just getting tired and like way more tired than he probably should have been. And I think a lot of that was because he was sort of figuring out Cruz, especially in the second and third round, where Cruz himself was not really moving in his figure eight pattern near as much. He was much more standard, just kind of standing in orthodox. He was still moving, but he wasn't as bouncy as he was in the first round. And Casey was kind of figuring out his timing, but I think that just took way too much effort for him to just think. I think he was thinking a lot about the strikes that he was throwing and when he needs to throw them, rather than kind of intuitively feeling the timing. And then he just had bad body language for the rest of it. So I don't know, it was a good win for Cruz.
Karyan?
Yeah, it was definitely a big unknown for me going into it. Casey Kenny is like a newer prospect to me. I'm not as familiar with some of his recent fights.
Were you familiar with his interview that he gave to Shikashan O'Malley, where he was talking about possibly sleeping with one of his coworkers?
No.
And how she wasn't attractive enough for him?
Oh, God. No one's attractive enough for that chin strap.
Yeah, the person he was talking about was Megan Anderson, and she rightly pointed out that doesn't really make for a comfortable work environment. Before this fight, that's the main thing anybody knew about this guy.
Well, I'm super impressed with, I don't know if it's just Dominick Cruz as a person and his skills, or if I'm more impressed with like his meniscus or whatever collagen supplements he takes. His ability to just keep that movement up and not only, be moving that way as so late in his career now after so many layoffs, but also then to be adding things like his kicking game, like improving. I noticed he like threw a right low kick and then immediately threw a right high kick, like in the same beat. And that's hard for kickboxers to do. Like that's high level for them. And he's doing it as, just an MMA fighter that's coming off of a wrestling base. He looked really impressive, definitely looking, older. I would agree with like Aaron that probably not in like title contention, at least not right now. And at bantamweight, maybe not again. It's a really, really good division. You really have to earn that, based on how he's talking, he might not want that either.
Like he normally, whenever he makes a comeback, he talks about another title run, but this time he didn't mention that. So I think what he didn't say spoke volumes to anybody who's been following Cruz for a long time. Alexander?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I wrote down for this fight was that Casey Kenny just seemed mesmerized in that same way that people get mesmerized by the movement of Dominick Cruz. I think what happens is the way that he moves is something they weren't able to emulate, so they think they have to figure it out before they can go ahead and do whatever it is they're going to do. And I think that's just the wrong way to approach it, because then you spend 3 rounds, especially in a 3-round fight, you spend 3 rounds just staring at him. And that, to me, in lots of ways, seemed like what happens. You just spend a lot of time just looking at him, being like, I don't know. And don't get me wrong, Dominick Cruz does things, you know what I'm saying? I'm not saying this is just some people's criticisms that he just moves around. I'm like, he doesn't just move around. That's a lot of what he does. But he also is a psychological fighter. He was taking advantage of the fact that Casey Kenny's a wrestler. So if you try to shoot on him or you duck your head, you level change on him, he's gonna beat you to that level change. And then he would level change and then throw those winging, almost Russian hooks. You know what I'm saying? With the head low and just kind of like throwing wildly, which you could probably call like a world star punch to the people who don't know the terms.
World star hip hop, one of those punches?
Yes, it's the world star hip hop punch.
He has World Star footwork too.
Dance Dance Revolution footwork.
Yeah, DDR.
He really does have DDR footwork.
He does tend to freeze you just like other fighters would a strike, right? Sometimes they hit you and you freeze, whereas he doesn't even hit you. He just moves and you freeze the same way as if you got hit.
It's something that I haven't seen too many times. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's very impressive. That's why I'm not trying to knock Dominick Cruz when I say he does things besides move, because movement is very important. It's a lot of the sport.
It does appear, though, that even though he is a bantamweight, meaning one of the smaller fighters in the UFC, he is somebody who does better with the giant cage. Definitely, his movement ran him onto the cage a lot, which he normally doesn't do when they fight in the standard size octagon. Next, we have the first main card fight between Alexander Raykic versus Diago Santos, with Raykic winning a competitive unanimous decision. The commentary was bad from the beginning, as we mentioned, but at the main card is when it started getting really bad.
Basically, the commentary just thought it was a boring fight.
Nothing happened. Like, according to the commentary, nothing happened.
You could probably take their commentary and lay it over the Francis Ngannou Derek Lewis fight, and it would that's what you thought that they were watching. When it's like, no, things were happening. It's just neither Santos or Raykic were just swinging for the fences, which is just what they wanted.
Especially Rogan kept talking about just go for it, take those risks, you know?
Why?
World Star.
Even DC was pushing back. He's like, why? He's winning. And it's like, yeah, you're winning, but you should, still go out there and like be willing to get knocked out to really win,
Yeah. They wanted to hit and not get hit. And because they both knew each other was big and they were both doing things to scare the other person off. Like they come in and they'd clip them. Diago a couple times sort of double jabbed inside of range. And then Raykic just closed the distance immediately and he was just a lot better in the clinch. Because Santos wanted to be in boxing range. But Raykic was just really good at keeping at either kickboxing range or clinch. And that's why the fight was not swanging and banging like everyone wanted. But yeah, it's just the commentary was just terrible because you watched that fight. And then I saw immediately on Twitter, because I was just also on Twitter. It's like, yeah, everyone just emulated what they said. They were like, oh, that's a boring fight. Blah, blah. And it's like, what are you watching? Like, did you not see? There's two big dudes hitting each other. It's fun.
It actually is not that different from an Israel Adesanya fight that people love, where as far as volume and number of feints, it's like a classic Izzy fight. And I would say even compared to Izzy, they were throwing more. But it's just not as pretty. The feints, the setups, they're not as pretty. The movements aren't as pretty as Izzy. But as far as volume and feints go, it was the same. So, it's about this narrative. Like Izzy's confidence and swagger made them think that he does a lot better than he does, or he's throwing strikes when he's not. Whereas if you don't have that, they think nothing happens.
And you saw that when we get to the main event, like they thought Izzy was just dominating the whole time just because he looked cool.
He does move cool. Even when he's doing nothing, he does like pose. Like he's constantly posing.
And Santos and Raykic went. And then especially Santos's past fights and stuff where they were very action-packed. They just went in expecting, oh yeah, he's going to do that. And then he didn't do that, so therefore it was boring.
Karian?
I mean, I could admit that, like, this fight, might not have been, like, a super high-paced fight or something. It might not have been, what a lot of casual MMA fans are looking for. But for the commentary to be like this was insane. It was, like, burying your own product. It really didn't make any sense at all.
When they, like, hype up some of the shittiest fights, too. And some of the shittiest performances.
It was like Bizarro World.
Where's the guy who hypes up Brendan Schaub's shitty comedy? Where was the Felicia Spencer commentary, right? During Cyborg when Felicia was doing nothing and they were hyping her up. Where was that?
Yeah, I mean, as far as the fight goes, I think this is kind of an example of it seeming like Santos might have hit his kind of size ceiling moving up at like light heavyweight. He looked noticeably a lot smaller than Raykic. He also was having some of that trouble where, as Aaron mentioned, he wanted to be in boxing range, not in clinching range or kickboxing range. But anytime he had the chance and he could kind of sort of cut the cage on Raykic, he seemed to have trouble being able to stop himself at a certain point, like to put his brakes on coming in from kickboxing range into boxing range. He always overshot. He ended up in clinch range and got turned around immediately, just out-muscled. If he could have maybe kept his distance a little bit better and stayed in that boxing range and tried to work on, building his combos and picking at Raykic against the fence where he can't just withdraw from everything, that could have been a better fight for him. But I just think he was hitting that point of, if I get too close to this guy, he's going to just muscle me and move me wherever. And if I stay out at range, he's going to pick me off with kicks and longer jabs than I have. I feel bad for both of them because, after all of this, after just being able to audibly hear the commentary too, because we aren't even mentioning that not only is the commentary worse, but they're in a building with no crowd. So the fighters hear the commentary the whole time. So while they're trying to fight, having, this big moment of their life in front of cameras, all they hear is Joe Rogan and DC being, they're not doing anything. They're not taking any risks. This sucks. And then to have to be interviewed by Rogan immediately after, Raykic is talking about having a family friend pass away before this fight and how he dedicated the fight to his friend. And Rogan has to be like, but you didn't do anything.
I think the fight would have felt a lot different if it was Bisping and Felder along with Anik.
Yeah.
This is an example of how having different commentary would have made the fight so much more enjoyable.
Yeah, commentary serves a function, and when it's done poorly, you get to see how it drags a product down.
Just anyone but DC and Rogan together.
Alexander, what did you think about the fight, especially with Santos coming off of 2 knee surgeries where it had to be completely reconstructed?
I think it's very interesting. I have a friend who tore his ACL and meniscus when we were in high school, and just watching him go through the whole physical rehabilitation process is very interesting, and just how long it took in the varying stages. And then also thinking about the way people have already talked about, he was trying to stay in boxing range. I think that lets me know a couple of things. One is that he doesn't feel as confident in his kicking, and there are probably only so many kicks he can throw before his legs start to hurt or his movement starts to really suffer. Either that, or there's only so many kicks that he can take before his movement starts to suffer, and he just doesn't want to find that out, And then I also think that to stay in boxing range but out of clinching range requires some fancy footwork to some extent, and I think that's what he was having trouble with a lot, is finding that particular range and finding the same, slide backs and shifts that he used against Yan. If you watch him fight Yan, he shifts backwards and then catches Yan when he's shifting. And I don't think he has that in his legs anymore. So it'll be very interesting to see how his style will adapt given that. I think he should develop a clinch game, and I think that'll serve him best, especially given what Karin's talking about as far as him overshooting, trying to get in the boxing range and ending up in clinching range. Hey, you might as well work it, because you got Glover out there, so it's not going to get any easier. I'm just not that impressed with Raykic. You know what I'm saying? People are big on it. Let me say, when I say I'm not that impressed with Raykic, what I mean is I don't think that he's going to be champion at any point. Because I think there are 2 or 3 people that I'm not even sure he can beat. I don't think he can beat Glover. I'm not sure if anyone can beat Glover, to be honest, until I see it. But back to Raykic, I think that he is going to have a lot of trouble if they match him up, like you were talking about the other day in the Discord, Sam, against Yuri Prohaska, because Raykic doesn't really seem to believe in punching. He likes a nice high guard, you know what I'm saying? He likes to keep that hand extended. He does throw jabs with it, and he does use it to block vision. He does use it to set up kicks. So he does do things with his hands. But power punching does not seem to be a thing that he enjoys or really wants to trade in. He seems to prefer to trade kicks or get in the clinching range. And I think Yuri is a guy who is going to stay in his face and manage to keep in boxing range, because that is sort of his specialty, is managing to fight guys in boxing range and just not really caring about things like leg kicks or being taken down. He has this habit of getting up and then just going really hard to knock people out after they take him down. So I think it'll be very interesting to see how Raykic adapts to a guy who can get him in boxing range and keep him in boxing range.
the fights that Raykic looked really good in, or even his knockouts, it was all with kicks. So I think that's a really good point. New guy, you have thoughts about this fight?
One of the functions of commentary is that it really affects how people remember the fight and really like the attributes of the two fighters going into the future. It affects the fighters' fandom. I have to think it affects what some of the matchmakers might be looking at when they're offering fights to these fighters. And yeah, it's just really unfortunate that when you have two commentators just going in on how much of a boring fight this is, it gets to the point where they spend all the time talking about what's not happening to the point where they aren't even doing the job of explaining what is happening in the cage. And it is just kind of a huge disservice to the fans and fighters. But as far as the fight itself, I felt that we learned more sort of where Thiago Santos stands in his career than the attributes and where Alexander Raykic is. I think Raykic played a really cautious fight, and he's a guy who, knows how to use the range that he wants to fight in, that kicking range. That being said, I think if you look at Alex mentioned how if you look at Santos' fight against Yan, he's using these shuffle steps. He has very active footwork. If you look at his fight against John Jones, his ability to close the distance, even as John was just like lighting his legs up, was really impressive. And we just didn't really see as much of that. Even as Raykic wasn't really targeting the legs as much as I would have expected. In the post-fight commentary, Raykic mentioned that he knew about some of Thiago's injuries, and that's maybe why he didn't target the legs as much, which I thought was classy, if it's true. I mean, who knows? But yeah, I felt that whether it be that Thiago Santos is still just injured, or if he's just a little bit more cautious about getting his legs injured, we're just like looking at him in a place where he might just need to make adjustments in terms of how he fights. And it's just kind of a tough thing because you lose your legs, and even if you make like a full recovery, you still just have to be thinking about that, because if you're out with leg injuries, you can't get that paycheck,
Next, we have Islam Makhachev versus Drew Dober, with Makhachev dominating Dober and then finally submitting him with an arm triangle in round 3. Makhachev isn't a Khabib Nurmagomedov clone like everyone thinks he is. First of all, he's taller and longer. He's also a southpaw. And also his grappling and striking styles are different as well. However, this doesn't mean he can't be just as dominant in his own way. New guy?
It was kind of hilarious that Joe Rogan spent like half the first round just talking up Drew Dober. Literally, like, even as Islam is taking him down and just taking position on him, you have Joe Rogan just being like, well, what's Drew Dober going to do now? Like, how's he going to find his way out of this one?
He's an assassin!
But yeah, I mean, the skill level difference in terms of grappling and wrestling was just really apparent here. All 3 rounds, Islam Makhachev, basically, like, if he can grab any part of you, even if he doesn't take you down, he's going to move you somewhere where he has the advantage. He's going to move you onto the fence. He's going to, just take whatever position he wants on you. And just how methodical he was really, really impressive. I also just wanted to say that, we pay so much attention in a fight like this to just the superiority of grappling. And we have this, or in this scenario, and we have this kind of narrative that, like maybe Drew Dober can come in and land a big strike and knock him out. But even in the couple of stand-up exchanges in the fight, I would say Islam won every single stand-up exchange. I mean, he was hitting Drew Dober with check hooks. He threw a flying knee. And he was just outdoing him. So this kind of narrative that these guys who really base their games around grappling and wrestling can't strike is just, we're just seeing it be proven untrue time and time and time again. It's just that, like, and he said it in his interview after the fight. He was just like, well, if I know that my wrestling is that much better, then that's the best way to win, and I'm just going to do that.
Karyan?
Yeah, this was a really great performance from Islam. His grappling is definitely different from Khabib in a few noticeable ways. A lot of things that you'll notice out of guys that come from, the Dagestan region or just really anywhere in Russia and are like really good grapplers is the fact that since so many of them have trained in Sambo and wrestling and judo, they kind of have a lot of avenues to go through when they're building their grappling style. And they don't really seem to differentiate between, like not using judo because they're wrestling right now or not using their wrestling because they're doing a judo technique. They, blend everything together so well. All of the takedowns were like, it doesn't seem like there was really a lot of takedowns. It just seems that once Islam Makhachev was able to secure one, the fight didn't get back up to the feet if he didn't want it to. He had excellent control in all of these positions, was passing guard really beautifully. And my one big complaint, again, about commentary, is for this one, when it was finished, it's really disappointing for both Joe Rogan and DC, who I know do have grappling experience, to just focus on, like, calling the submission a weird shoulder pressure. I don't know why he tapped.
Yeah.
I don't know. It could be anything. Like, obviously, he's just squeezing. Like, no, his head is tucked under Dober's arm in a way that, his elbow is like pointing towards the ceiling and his wrist is jammed in his own neck. And it's very clearly an arm triangle. That's what makes an arm triangle an arm triangle, is having that side of the neck closed off by your own arm. But since he was, in half guard and didn't pass off to the side and do everything the way that you're supposed to do because Eddie Bravo showed you how to do it that way, it's not an arm triangle, I guess.
Yeah, for all of you who still say, because of childhood nostalgia, that Rogan is good at breaking down and teaching people about what happens on the ground, no, just no. Alexander?
Islam Makhachev is just like a weighted blanket. Not even a wet blanket, but a weighted like 20, 25-pound blanket. Because when he had Drew Dober in half guard, you could just see the downward pressure that he was able to maintain. Because even when Dober was able to get like a butterfly hook in there, it didn't matter. He just crushed it. It made no difference. He was like, okay, I'm not impressed. And given that he's already beaten Davi Ramos and he already beat Arman Sarukian, who's a great grappler, both of them great grapplers in different ways, it's hard for me to see who's going to beat him on the way up.
He definitely needs a top 5 fight because he's on a 7-fight winning streak and his record is 19-1. Anything at welterweight and above, that type of record would mean not only were you champion, but you've defended it 3 times. He's long overdue for a top 5 opponent, but secondly, it shows you how competitive it is from 155 and below. Aaron?
I'm largely grappling ignorant, and watching that, Joe and DC, they were just saying that, Islam is basically doing really well. And it's like, I can see that, guys. Do you want to tell me what's happening? Like, I can tell that he's winning. And then they just didn't. And it was actually the same thing that they did with Dominick Cruz, where with Dominick Cruz, they just said that he moved his feet a lot and he did stuff like standing square, and they didn't extrapolate at all about how that might help him or why it works. And it was the same thing here.
They said he invented his own footwork and they didn't explain what the footwork was. They just said it's weird.
It's weird. Yeah. He stands square and that shouldn't work. And it's like, okay, well, why does it work now? But the same thing here. Like, as someone who, I could watch that and all I could tell is just, he is obviously a lot better at grappling than Drew Dober. And it looked like Drew Dober just kind of accepted it from the first round. He was like, I'm not going to win this unless I catch him with a punch. As soon as he takes me down, I'm just going to try to survive. And he seemed fine with that. Didn't seem dejected. But watching it, it was just like, the commentary just didn't help me understand what was happening besides the fact that Islam was winning. And I can tell that myself.
Whatever they added, your eyes could already figure out. So basically then all they did add was like a net negative because they were disagreeing with what your eyes were seeing oftentimes.
Yeah, exactly.
A note to our loyal listeners. If you love the show, please support us and help us get paid for our labor by joining Team Southpaw on Patreon. By becoming a member, you'll get access to bonus content like exclusive articles, fight previews, bonus episodes, transcripts of fight studies, and access to our private chat group on Discord. But more importantly, you will help us supplement the cost of the show, the incredible time and energy Sam and I put into making the show, and you'll be giving us some breathing room not only to juggle Southpaw with our day jobs, but also expand Southpaw into other areas. Show your Southpaw solidarity by supporting us at patreon.com/southpawpod.
Just when you thought we couldn't shit on the commentary anymore, we haven't even gotten to the most egregious fights. Because next we have our first title fight, which was between Petr Yan and Aljamain Sterling, with Sterling winning via illegal knee disqualification. But there's so much to comment on from the actual fight itself, the UFC protocols, and especially Joe Rogan's commentary. I mean, him and DC are a bad combo, but especially for Joe just by himself for this fight, it was, let me just put it this way. I woke up this morning still pissed off at Joe Rogan. So that's how awful it was. Karian?
I'll start off just by, what I saw in the fight, which was a good start for Aljamain. I definitely liked, he came out and was pressuring Yan back, was throwing a lot of jabs and straights into hand traps where he wasn't actually trying to throw a jab, but he would just kind of grab Yan's wrist for a second. And when he had that hand pinned, he would throw off a low kick. That way, he knows there's no counters coming back. He was not really going too much to his wrestling. In fact, I think he was kind of hoping that he could put the pace on Yan enough that he would try to shoot in a few times like he did off of caught kicks. He landed a few really good flying knees off of, Yan kind of dipping a little bit like he might think about a level change in the first round. Then he got caught with a really hard right hand that dropped him, but that was really the only success Yan had in that round. Going forward from that, Yan seemed to realize, okay, I can just kind of shell up a little bit, stop trying to counter as much, and then when he, has that break of trying to figure out why he can't hurt me, then I can counter him. And that seemed to be working a lot better for him. Yeah, he was definitely starting to win the fight going into the fourth round. Aljamain started to look a little bit tired, not nearly as bad as commentary might have been saying. But then, yeah, the down knee to a downed opponent. Very blatantly after what looked like a weird sort of headbutt to the shoulder from Yan and looking to his corner and then throwing it, which in the press fight conference he tried to say, he was looking for Aljamain's hands and just forgot about his knees, which is how are you in the middle of a fight with a man and you forget he has lower body? Yeah, it was gross to see just a flagrant foul like that, and then to see it discussed as a freak accident. They're talking about it as if Aljamain Sterling has just been struck by lightning in the middle of the cage for no reason.
Yeah, he got struck by lightning. Does that mean the title changes hands? No, right?
No, yeah. That was an act of God. It's fine. Mistakes happen, I get it, but it's hard to believe that with some of the bad blood coming into this and the things that are said. It's, hard to take someone's word on it after they just knee a man in the face. I'm of the opinion that it might get me, a lot of hate from the MMA community at large, but I just don't think Petr Yan should be going into an immediate rematch or anything like that. Even if Aljamain Sterling wants that fight, I just think, at the very least, you need a slap on the wrist time off to be whoa, could you at least think about, following the rules, please, and not just blasting someone with an illegal strike.
That hasn't been brought up at all, if he should be suspended or not, and I think he should.
not only is that a rule break, that's a big one, and a one that hurts because, as we've all talked about amongst ourselves, like the consent of mixed martial arts is what makes it a sport that we want to continue doing. Without that consent, this is just an assault.
Alexander?
Oh boy. Okay. So let me start with the fight. Aljamain Sterling fought a good first round. He fought a fight like a guy who said what he said beforehand. And what he had said beforehand is that he just wanted to come out there and smash Petr Yan. That's what he wanted to do, just come out there and smash this dude. And he kind of fought like that in the very way that I described to my roommate earlier today as Kevin Lee-ish, where in the first round, he goes really hard. And that's really his game plan, is to try to make the guy wilt under the pressure of being face-to-face with Aljamain Sterling. And it didn't seem to work. And then over time, I think Petr Yan started to get his timing and started to pull the fight in the other direction until we got to the very flagrant and illegal knee to a downed opponent. And here's the thing. I get into this argument with my roommate all the time, and even Demetrius Johnson aggravated me on Twitter because, and I'll call him out, DJ, what's up? You listen to this. You totally listen to this. He brought up the point. He's like, oh, well, those should be allowed anyway. And that's not the debate. That's the thing, is that's not what we're talking about at all. That's derailing the issue. The issue is not should knees be allowed or should knees not be allowed. The issue is, should you commit flagrant fouls in the middle of a title fight, in the middle of any fight? And the answer is no. It's that simple.
It's like somebody who gives themselves a black belt, even though they didn't earn a black belt, and then somebody making a case like, well, we shouldn't have belts in the first place. Okay, but that's not what we're talking about here.
Exactly. I'm of the opinion that if you've been training MMA for as long as he has been training, and you've made it to the point where you are the champion, you know what the word punch means. So when you hear somebody say just punches in the corner,
yeah,
you know what just punches means. So that aggravated me to no end, because then you have Joe Rogan on, you have these people speculating on air about what was said in the corner, because apparently Khabib told someone that maybe he heard the word kick instead of punch. I don't know why Joe Rogan decided to go off about this.
Him bringing up Khabib is like bringing up some schoolyard gossip and using it as a verified source, using it as verified fact. Well, actually, I heard from a friend who happened to be near this other person who heard that he had said this.
The fight gets stopped, and then this is the thing. I think Petr Yan needs to be suspended. I think the ref needs a fine, because he waited too long to stop the fight, and they did that thing that they do in MMA, which I can't stand, which is where they give the fighter an opportunity to sustain further damage when it's clear that they cannot continue. And so that aggravated me to no end. He said he would do cognitive tests, and then he did whatever tests he was going to do, and then he called the doctor in anyway. And they both continued to ask Aljamain Sterling if he wanted to continue.
His eyes are crossed.
Ooh.
He's like, bro, I can't stand.
Ooh.
Dude, and also in the replay, when he got hit, he literally got lifted off the ground. And it's like they waited so long to bring in the doctor.
Yeah, having watched a lot of legal knees in you know what I'm saying, organizations where those are legal, that is one of the most vicious knees that I have ever seen.
Sterling tweeted that the reason why the knee landed so hard was because also he was in a position where you're not allowed to knee. So he wasn't prepared for the knee. He wasn't braced for the knee. Whereas with legal knees, you brace for it, you block it with a forearm, or you just stiffen up. Whereas here, that was like the last thing he was expecting.
Yeah, that was so disgusting. I think Joe Rogan needs a fine too. Because Joe Rogan, I told you, I said he needs a fine, because these are some of the things that Joe Rogan said. He said, I bet Aljamain feels like the title is illegitimate. He questioned the score when they read off the open scores, when they actually got the scores of the scorecards. It was 29-28, 29-28, 28-29. One for Aljamain. And he was like, really? He suggested a 1-point deduction and was talking about how it would have been, oh man. Yeah, was talking about how it would have been an even fight had there been a 1-point deduction. And then, yeah, in the post-fight, told Aljamain Sterling, I just threw my notes, told Aljamain Sterling the scorecard for some reason, told him that he was losing the fight for some reason, and then turned around, and right after that, I got to grab my notes again because I have to figure out what the heck I was talking about. I made myself mad here. And then he mentioned the Khabib thing, and it's like, what are you doing? You are speculating on air. You are feeding into this narrative that this man has kind of taken the quote unquote easy way out. This is a quote unquote illegitimate win, when in reality, all he did was get fouled flagrantly and then abide by the rules when he couldn't continue.
It was victim blaming. On top of that, he didn't even question, he was making an argument that you shouldn't be able to win a title this way. And even DC, who is such a Rogan bootlicker, was telling him, like, no, Joe, no. And then even Anik was like, no, Joe, no. Like, so that's how bad Rogan was getting. And even just interviewing Sterling in the first place, even like the biggest chuds in MMA, like the biggest chud fighters were like saying, what the hell is Rogan doing? Like, this was so bad. Even the dude bros of MMA were like, abolish Joe Rogan. Aaron, you got something?
It's a shame that the fight ended the way it did for obvious reasons, but also just because it was a good fight.
It was actually a masterclass from both sides. So it was unfortunate that it ended because it was so good.
Like, Aljo was getting in his stuff early, and Yan was probably getting the better or taking better advantage of his exchanges than Aljo was, in my opinion. But Yan seemed comfortable. He had a very active guard. He was just seemed like he was just sort of processing information, because he starts off slow generally, but like he's just sort of processing what Aljo was giving, and he was starting to time and getting on his own, and Aljo was tiring. It was a nice narrative to the fight where it was turning to Yan. Aljo probably could have stuck and move a bit more, use his reach, especially when Yan was timing him, just sort of stick out at range, jab, kick, step back, gather his breath a bit more, because it was visibly tiring. But then, the illegal knee, it was almost perfectly set up to be an intentional foul. Like, if the ref says that he's down, and then he waits like 2 seconds, and then he just perfectly knees him, and it like knocks him out. Whereas, like, if the ref hadn't said that, I don't know that they would have necessarily called it an intentional foul. And then the title changing hands, it might have just become a DQ or no contest or whatever, and then the title wouldn't change hands. And the whole thing at the end where Sterling wanted to be interviewed, and then the UFC let him, which they should not. He's concussed enough that they stopped the fight. And they're like, you should go talk to Joe. And then, Joe's trying to tell this concussed guy, like, hey, Khabib said he heard something from the corner, and then, here's like a whole bunch of numbers of judges. Like, hey, 28-29, 28-29, 29-28, one was for you. And it's like, I can't imagine being concussed and being told all of that information and actually being able to process it in a coherent way.
Hey, I know you're concussed, but it's not Petr Yan's fault. And secondly, you lost. I thought you were losing, and your title is illegitimate. You shouldn't have won it this way. What do you think?
Yeah, like, he should not be put in that situation. Interview him the next day, 2 days after, whatever it is, like however long he takes to recover.
Did you know that Joe Rogan is known for his interviews? Like, he's popular. He has a show where he interviews people. This is what he's known for. That he's apparently a good interviewer. Did you know that?
Oh. The whole thing was just so messy and bad. And like, I can see it as it's happening, like, because it's obviously like it's an organizational thing. I think I sort of said this in the chat, where because the whole not interviewing people who got knocked out was, I think, happened after Joe interviewed Overeem, when he was saying that he felt the tap and all that, and he realized, like, he's out of it. I shouldn't interview him anymore. And then he broke that rule to interview DC, and then he later also regretted that. But it's not a hard and fast rule. Like, it's not a rule. It's just a thing that they do. So there's no institutional rule to say, he's been knocked out. Okay, you're not going to get an interview. And that's what it should be. It's like, it's an organizational failure and an individual failure on Joe's part. I hated it. It was so messy. Like, I hate the whole situation. Yan should be suspended. I hate that they're going to do the immediate rematch as fast as they possibly can.
New guy?
Yeah, I mean, this fight is kind of like UFC trademark fight. Like this is just what the UFC does at this point. It's like every time we have an exciting fight that everyone's looking forward to, or hey, like how about you look at the whole trilogy of Stipe DC? The whole narrative of that trilogy is eye pokes 3 times. You know, we have this fight, which in my opinion, this was the fight that I was most excited for on the card. And, you know, we have a new champion in arguably the deepest, highest skill level weight class in the UFC who just won his belt via a DQ. And it's just crazy because it's just, the reason I say this is a UFC trademark is because the UFC, there are ostensibly, you know, rules in trade, or in quote, air quotations, but no one really seems to be clear on what the procedures are if someone in any situation or capacity breaks those rules.
They don't even know how to do replays.
Yeah, they don't know how to do replays. People are coming in overweight and they're like, oh yeah, you'll take a little bit of money from you. We don't know. And when it happens, it's just like, it's ugly. And it looks like this sometimes, where you have a concussed man talking to Joe Rogan, who's apparently not a concussed man.
It just seems like satire, you know, like an Onion article. Joe Rogan interviews concussed man.
Yeah. And it's like, this is already a meme. Like, this already got turned into a meme. And it's crazy because the guy that it got turned into a meme about is sitting right there talking to Joe Rogan. Like, it's just crazy that this happens. It's surreal to watch. And it was surreal, too, because the foul itself, watching it, it almost just seemed like it happened in slow motion. And maybe that's just how I'm remembering it because it was just so brutal. But, like, I feel like anyone watching that who has watched MMA or has watched UFC for a meaningful amount of time to kind of be familiar with the rules was watching up until that point going like, yeah, Sterling is downed.
Even the fans know the rule.
Hopefully he doesn't kick him. And when it happened, it's crazy that it took that long for not just the ref, not just the doctor, but like seemingly everyone in the building to know what to do or how it should be handled. And it's not just the people in the building, the commentators, the ref, whoever. It's, you know, you go on Twitter and you see people saying shit like, oh, give this man an Oscar. You know, so it's not like you see this kind of complete like lack of knowledge for what to do, or just in terms of procedure, not just on the structural level of people in the building whose jobs it is to talk to or not talk to fighters, or to call the fights, or to referee the fights. It seeps out into the broader culture of the sport as well. You know, so it's just interesting that you see this kind of, I mean, you know, like it's, you woke up mad about it. Like we were mad about it when it happens. Then it's like you go on Twitter and you see people saying these kinds of things, and it just makes you even more angry because this isn't really new. Like, sure, this is the first time a champion has been crowned through a DQ, but it's like we've seen bullshit like this happen all the time in the UFC. People identify the problems and nothing ever changes.
Related to this topic, I highly encourage everybody to listen to episode 52, The Hidden Ethics of Combat Sports, where I really break down and discuss consent in combat sports and why it's so important and how it's been historically embedded into prize fights. So definitely check that out. It'll give you a framework about how to think about this. But as far as what happened, this is on the UFC and they definitely need some kind of protocol, like hard rules. Illegal move that drops a fighter means immediate DQ, no discussion. Bring in doctors right away. No interview, immediate hospital, and also no discussion about whether the decision is valid or not. Don't make what is simple and clear cut seem complicated or that the victory is illegitimate. These were all the failures of the UFC last night. And I think for conscientious MMA fans, this is what upset so many of us. Next, we have UFC GOAT Amanda Nunes, who is criminally underpaid, defending her featherweight title against Megan Anderson. Nunes finished Anderson in the first round via triangle armbar. Aaron, because you're somebody who watches a lot of boxing as well and follow boxing, what do you think about Amanda Nunes going into boxing? How do you think she would do? Because it seems like the only big payday left that is realistic isn't even a fight with Kayla Harrison unless she decides to leave PFL, because UFC won't do co-promotions. But what the UFC has done at least one time is allowing them to go off and do a different sport then. And so one big payday fight that has been brought up for Amanda Nunes is, and possibly the only realistic big payday fight for her would be against Clarissa Shields. What do you think about that possibility?
Like, I think she'd do okay. I mean, it's sort of like most pure sort of boxing striking in MMA, where it's not great, obviously, but it's a different sport. It doesn't need to be technically correct so far as boxing goes because there's other things to worry about in MMA. I don't know how she would do. I would like that fight. That would be fun to watch. I feel like she might lose just because it's a different sport that Clarissa Shields is obviously just been practicing for her whole life. So I would bet on Clarissa Shields.
It would be the only time you would bet against Nunes.
Yeah. That'd be an interesting fight. I very much doubt that it happens, even if I think Nunes wants it, because she hasn't really said anything about that.
They teased it for a month or two and then went nowhere.
Yeah, because I think as well, it's women's boxing is just not really a draw for various reasons. So I don't think it's similar to like Masvidal or Conor, obviously with Floyd, where I don't think the UFC would think there's enough money in there to want to bother doing that and then risk Nunes losing, and especially then if Clarissa Shields is going to go to like PFL or whatever. It's like I don't think the business side makes sense for the UFC, even though that would be an interesting fight. And if the Ali Act was applied to MMA, possibly could happen.
The one precedent we have is UFC did it when they were talking about a fight that would generate more than $100 million, right?
Yeah, exactly. When like Conor, they don't want to make another Conor McGregor because he had way too much leverage for the UFC to control him effectively at that point, and they don't want to do that again.
And also, they're not going to go out of their way if they're just going to get, 50% of a cut where the purse for Nunes might be just $1 million,
Yeah, exactly. They can just make enough. They can make more money just feeding whoever to Nunes for as long as she wants to fight in the UFC.
Karian, how do you think Megan Anderson looked after the first time she got hit by Amanda Nunes?
Yeah, I feel like she probably had a huge problem with dealing with that power. Even if she could have recovered, physically, even if it wasn't as bad as being rocked as some other people have been, just that mental factor is going to make it so much harder to get back into it when you have this feeling of like, well, what do I do for that? Like there's nothing I can do to make this person hit, less hard. This is how strong she is.
With Megan Anderson, it looked like after the first strike, she just froze. Like
she looked a lot like people that are, in shock.
They're kind of like deer in headlights, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Once she got hit that first time really hard, I didn't even really see her like moving her head to follow Nunes's movement or anything. Even she just kind of was trying to follow her with her eyes. And
you saw Nunes also react where after she hit her and then Nunes saw how she reacted. She's like, oh, she's scared. That's when Nunes went in for the kill.
I do just want to I think it's important to say 145 as a weight class in the UFC is definitely having a little bit of a struggle keeping, good fights going and keeping it competitive just because they don't have a lot of fighters. But I think it's really important to highlight that's not a fault of the fighters or the women that compete in the sport. That's a fault of the UFC. Because even with, on top of everything else that we constantly are talking about in the culture of the sport, with the Casey Kinney thing that we mentioned, and how uncomfortable that makes me and Anderson feel in this environment. Why would any more women want to fight for you? You know, like, why would they want to put themselves in that environment if they're also not getting paid as much as the men? Like, they're not making that money that, you know, is the draw for the men's divisions to come in here and put their life on their line and, you know, maybe, you know, deal with a company they don't completely agree with. But that motivation's not there for women. Why would they put up with it?
I don't even think Amanda Nunes has ever made the same amount of money Ronda Rousey made.
No, I don't think so.
Which speaks volumes. So, and even without much of a roster, they could first of all fill it up, and secondly, it's not that different from the UFC men's heavyweight division. Let's be honest here, right?
Exactly.
Now we have the main event of the night: Jan Blachowicz defending his light heavyweight title against the middleweight champion Israel Adesanya. Even though Blachowicz was the champion, he was the underdog once again in this fight. Other than against an undersized old Ronaldo Jacare Souza, Blachowicz has been an underdog in every one of his UFC fights. Blachowicz won a comfortable decision, but the commentary for this fight was probably the worst commentating all night, including the Petr Yan Aljamain Sterling fight. The commentary for the Sterling fight was more dangerous, I would say, but as far as just like being so far from the truth, this takes the cake. During this fight is when he really started trending on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. Basically, the only people who think Rogan is good at MMA analysis are people who don't watch MMA, because at this point, the people who do watch MMA understand what Joe Rogan is. But both DC and Rogan were burying Blachowicz, even though he was winning. And Bruce Buffer kept screwing up his name. Give the man some damn respect. And if you watched, listened to, or read Paul's Vet to Champ episode on Jan Blachowicz, you were not surprised at all by this outcome. Blachowicz is jittery, yes, but you can be jittery and effective. And I think especially the commentary and even the odds makers get mesmerized by like confidence. So they unconsciously weigh confidence more than effectiveness. Jan looked jittery, but he was effective, not just in this fight. He just looks jittery in all of his fights. He just is kind of like herky-jerky in that way, but he still wins. And he still not even just wins by knocking people out. He just outlands people as well. And he just controls the ring. He controls the clinch. He just has been better than all of his opponents for a long time. Aaron?
They mentioned constantly that Jan was biting on a lot of feints that Izzy was throwing. But feints don't score points.
Not according to Rogan's metric, right? Every time he was feinting, Rogan kept saying he was outstriking him.
Yeah, it's like they were falling for Izzy's feints as well. Like, it's like, yeah, Izzy was feinting a lot and Jan was biting on almost every single feint. But Izzy wasn't building an offense off of that. He wasn't taking advantage of Jan's reactions to his feints. He was just feinting for feinting's sake, which, like, maybe that sort of slowed Jan a little bit. But still, it's like feinting doesn't score points. And Jan was, when he was hitting him hard. He was sort of, forcing him into clinch positions. He was being measured and honest. And yeah, it was weird watching it to analyze it and thinking, okay, yeah, Jan's kind of winning this comfortably. It's close, but I felt that Jan was winning, most of the rounds. And then sort of going to Twitter after the fight and seeing people absolutely confused as to why he won 4 rounds to 1. And it's like, what fight were you watching? Or were you just listening to the commentary? Or were you, what I think a lot of people do, especially with Izzy, they're just looking at Izzy and just looking at what he's doing, as opposed to like actually watching the fight and what is happening. So yeah, it was a really nice performance by Jan. Measured, used his size when he needed to use his size, obviously in the last 2 rounds, taking him down and just holding him down. But yeah, he was getting some good kicks in, some good punches in, and Izzy just wasn't doing enough. Like, I think Izzy could have won that fight if he was better at entering and and initiating, but he's too much of a pure counter striker. He was too much just waiting for Yan to blitz forward or something and try to counter him.
Izzy was still downloading. Even when the fight was over, Izzy was still waiting and downloading.
So yeah, that's mostly, there's obviously some more technical stuff, but like, yeah, Izzy just didn't do enough. He could have done a lot more. He seems to have the skill set, but not the mindset to do a lot more than what he did, because he just wants to counter, and that's where he's comfortable. And he doesn't seem particularly comfortable sort of initiating more when he probably should.
You look at the narrative difference, right, with Izzy and Raykic, where their volume was about the same, except that same volume when Izzy's doing it, Rogan and DC are going crazy. Whereas with Raykic, they're like, he's not doing anything. New guy?
As Izzy was kicking the calves, I think Yan's calves held up a lot better than Paulo Costa, but I noticed that he really started shooting the takedown as his legs started getting lifted from those kicks. And I just thought it was a really good instinct on Yan's part to really start playing towards that advantage and moving the fight onto a sort of different playing field when he noticed that technique starting to have an effect. That being said, up until that point, Izzy was certainly not making him his fool. He was winning on strikes. One question that I had was if he was going to be able to land that liver kick that he used on Dominic Reyes, and he landed it several times on Izzy while Izzy was backing up, and that really impressed me. So yeah, I think it's just another great win for Yan. I'm sure they're going to make him an underdog again, just because.
Just because. Karyan?
This was a really good fight from Yan. This was like a really patient, more thought out fight than some people kind of expect him to have. I think a lot of people still characterize Yan as someone that's going to bull rush into exchanges. Like inevitably, it's going to happen sometime in this fight. And there really wasn't any, abandoning of caution in this fight. Yan was fighting behind a good jab and kicks. He was keeping his distance. He wasn't. It's insane to me that Rogan is on commentary talking about him biting on every single feint, because if he were biting on Izzy's feints, Izzy would be happy and Izzy would be winning.
Even Izzy thought he did worse than Joe Rogan and DC did.
Yeah, someone who's oozing confidence isn't that confident in himself. Izzy was feinting just as much as he always does, showing really clever hip feints, showing feinted jabs, feinted straights, and Yan just wasn't biting on those. He knew who he was fighting, and he knew how that worked.
So something to correct is how people think Blachowicz was biting on all of Izzy's feints, and he was semi-biting, meaning he would start to parry and catch himself. But that's not the bite that Adesanya wants or needs. He needs them to bite on the feint and throw. So he needs to draw out their strikes so that he could counter. And that's not what he got. And that's part of why Izzy kept waiting.
Yeah, the way Aaron said that, it'd be good to see Izzy, go forward more and enter in exchanges more and do more things, and he might have won this fight. I feel like it's almost just kind of like a mental block for him, where he likes to be that counter striker, because when you're counter striking, you get that one and done clean knockout and you feel really powerful. Going forward, you have to put more together, and you have to get comfortable with the fact that not every strike is going to be, a world beater. And I don't think he likes that. I think that makes him feel bad about himself. It makes him lose that confidence, and he's not okay with that. Yan, however, seemed completely content to put on, whatever fight he needed to win. As New Guy mentioned, he started timing those takedowns beautifully once the calf kick started to affect him, and he started to realize that, that might be a thing that could change the fight if he let it keep happening. I think that's a really good mentality to have. I like seeing guys that are always considered the underdog like this coming into these fights and treating it almost the way you would treat an insanely hard boss fight in a video game, where you're like, I have to be focused. I have to do everything right. And then once the switch happens and I'm in a different phase, I have to know how to change my game plan. I have to know, what to do. And I can feel the momentum swing for myself. It was an absolutely beautiful fight from him. A thing that I thought was hilarious, not only about the commentary being bad, but also just about Dana White as a person being just full of shit, was him saying that, when he came into the octagon to put the belt on Jan Blachowicz after the fight in the press conference, he said Jan turned around and just yelled in his face, "You don't believe in me." And Dana was like, "What do you mean? What? Like, what made you think that? I love all these fighters. Like, you're all so good." Like, as if he wasn't obviously, angling, like, Izzy's going to win this and then we can have a John Jones fight. It'll be great.
Alexander?
Yeah, this looked like, I don't know. I thought Izzy came out looking kind of like sluggish, looking a little bit stale. Just looking not as confident in general as I've seen him in some of his other fights. It looked very similar to the Anderson Silva fight for me, where it was like a lot of feints, and it seemed like his confidence wasn't where it needed to be. And at the end of the fight, his kind of refrain seemed to just be like, "Hey, look, well, I tried," and he's right, he did. Don't get me wrong, I'm not knocking him for trying to move up weight and stepping out of his comfort zone, but it definitely does show that, like, hey, once you get in front of some grapplers, and once you get in front of some kickboxers who have eaten some really big strikes, it gets a little bit more difficult. That being said, I think he's fine at 185 in his future. I think Jan did a great job, but it still doesn't tell me anything about Jan versus Glover, which is a match that I still need to have happen. I know I'm always looking to the future. Like, I'm always like, what's the next fight? But at the same time, come on. We need that fight. But overall, I thought, it wasn't the super ultra entertaining slugfest, if that's what people want, but it wasn't a bad fight. Like, I don't know if people are trying to paint this narrative that it was like a boring fight or like something like that, or like, you know what I'm saying? Or Jan didn't really do anything. I don't really get it.
To close out on some of the things y'all were bringing up, it's true that Blachowicz would bite on feints. The commentary was right about that, but then they would talk over Blachowicz, like talk over what he's doing immediately after, right? They would just keep pointing that out. Look, he's biting on the feint, and then immediately stop watching what Blachowicz is doing and just listen to themselves. But if they stopped talking and actually paid attention, what they would have noticed is as soon as Blachowicz would bite on a feint, actually, Izzy in some ways feints too much, because he would feint and then he would think about feinting again, or he would wait to counter. And during that time, right after Blachowicz bites on a feint, he would immediately hit Izzy. So he's like, "Oh, I bit on that feint. I need to jab him before he hits me." So he would keep jamming Izzy's counters. Izzy never got a chance to counter, because every time he had a chance to counter, Blachowicz would recognize what just happened and counter him first. So it's like, "Oh, I just bit on his hand pump. I need to jab him. Oh, I just bit on his hip feint. I need to kick him. Oh, I just bit on this. I need to do a marching left body kick. I need to throw a right to his body." Not every time, but like a lot of times, how Blachowicz found his openings was to capitalize on Izzy waiting to counter. I think Blachowicz recognized that he couldn't stop biting on the feints, but what he could do is immediately throw after biting, right? And I think this is similar to what Gastelum did, where Gastelum didn't bite at all. Every time Izzy feinted, Gastelum hit him. Blachowicz did something very similar to that, except the timing was different. Just like everything with Blachowicz is different with his timing, because everything is all a little bit off. In the interviews, Blachowicz talked about how they had this game plan and they weren't going to give too much away. And so in the fight, you saw how Blachowicz really took advantage of Izzy's habit of leaning backwards. Izzy talks about how he changes for each fight, but it's like there's a lot of things he will not change that he will always do, which is he will lean back away from strikes, he will feint, and he will slide back. And so every time Izzy leaned back, Blachowicz hit him. Every time Izzy leaned back, that's when Blachowicz found his opportunity to take him down. Every time that Izzy would slide back, Blachowicz would step in and kick him. And also, Izzy has a habit of baiting counters, right? By leaning forward and heavy on his front foot, and Blachowicz would kick him. But then the commentary kept saying he wasn't doing anything. There was one point where Rogan said he's doing stuff because they were showing him the replay, so he couldn't deny what he was seeing. But he's like, but they're not doing any damage, right? And also in the post-fight interview, Rogan really wanted to hype him up, trying to kind of say that he got robbed. But Adesanya was saying, no, I lost the fight. that Blachowicz was out fighting him in every way. And he even made this comment about he didn't know why his legs hurt and why they felt tired. And this is where Rogan could have come in, but instead Rogan didn't know either. And it's like, both of you, didn't you realize Blachowicz checked every one of your kicks? And on top of that, Blachowicz was also kicking his legs. And so Blachowicz was doing a better job checking kicks than Adesanya was. So that's why your legs felt like that, because they were getting beat up. And one other thing I want to point out is after the fight, before Blachowicz was announced the winner, what it sounded like to me was Blachowicz saying to him, "Did you make a lot of money? Are you happy?" Did any of you notice that?
It's because I think Izzy was complimenting his guard, and then Yan misunderstood and thought that Izzy was making a joke saying, "Hey, do you want to be my bodyguard?" And so that's why Yan was like, "Oh, do you pay well?" and then Izzy was confused because he's like, "What are you talking about?" Like,
but it was a great moment where it's almost like, "Hey, man, if you could pay me more than what the UFC is paying me, because they're paying me shit pay, I'll be your body." It actually looked like Blachowicz was being earnest, like was actually asking him about money, like he wanted to know because he didn't think they were being picked up.
Yeah.
That's what it looked like. It's like, "Are you making good money? Oh, can you pay me good money? Like, what's going on here? UFC's not paying me that well." It sounded like one of those kind of like gig economy talks. Like, oh, you got a gig? You got a side gig? How much does that pay? Talk to me after the fight. I'm interested. I'm listening.
How much are you making on Uber, Izzy?
But it definitely seemed like Blachowicz was interested in making more money, and he wasn't happy with the money he was making. And I think a lot of times when he says he's not being respected, he means that in twofold. People are counting him out, but secondly, that he's not being paid well. And I totally believe he's not being paid well. I'd be surprised if he's making even $200,000 a fight. Now let's talk about the Dom Cruz post-fight interview and Dana's comments in the press conference. Basically, Cruz was calling out Hans Molenkamp, who handles Monster Energy's MMA sponsorships, and was talking about their predatory practices, for those of you who were confused by his call out. Karin, can you explain to us what happened in the post-fight press conference?
In the post-fight press conference, Dana was mostly just kind of burying Cruz, even bringing this up at all, trying to be like, Monster's a great company. They take care of these fighters super well. Hans Molenkamp's, he's a weird guy, but like he's who does their sponsors. You have to deal with him. It's a privilege to have the money from him. Tried to specifically bring up numbers about like the Monster contracts. I believe at one point he was like, "Yeah, the owner of Monster, when we were talking, and he was like, well, I want to add 25,000 more to the fighters. So like, how are you going to complain?" Like, just completely trying to like act as if Dominick Cruz has no argument and no reason to gripe about any of this at all.
So taking the side of a corporate sponsor over his own fighters.
Yes. 100%. It sounds a lot like having like a dad or something in your family that you call out like an uncle for like just saying some really mean, like bad shit to you. And your dad's like, "Oh, well, he gave us money, so like he takes care of us. Okay. Like you can't say that."
This is kind of obviously not armchair psychology, but reading Dana White, it feels like I don't think he likes Hans Molenkamp, the person, just because he says he's a goofy dude, and he also mentioned that he knows that fighters have had problems with him. So he knows what Cruz is talking about when Cruz was calling him out for predatory practices, but he was full on corporate protection mode. That's why he said that little anecdote about that he was like, "Yeah, well, if you get the sponsorship, we'll do this much." But Monster Energy said, no. Hey, we'll pay an extra $25,000. It's completely unnecessary because Cruz's problem is with Hans Molenkamp and not Monster Energy. Cruz's problem is with the particular guy who handles the sponsorships from Monster Energy and not Monster Energy, the corporation. But Dana switched it to be about Monster Energy, and look at how good Monster Energy is for the fighters. They're giving them money and stuff, and it's just like, yeah, well, they're one of the few sponsors that you allow them to have, and so they're forced to go through this guy, and that's why Cruz was upset at it. It was just a complete corporate like protection mode. He obviously wasn't going to go into it, and the reporters weren't particularly going to ask any hard questions because he sidelined, because there's an old Instagram post where
This was before WME, that old Instagram post, I believe.
Yes, and he calls out Hans Molenkamp, and it sounds like from that Instagram post that it's very, very similar sort of stuff to what Cruz is talking about, because Cruz's problem is that he's holding these sponsorships, dangling them from a rope, that the fighters have to jump through all these hoops. That was a lot of metaphors. That fighters have to jump through all these hoops to satisfy his personal whims, like appearing in his Instagram feed and doing all this other stuff for him so that they can get these sponsorships. And it sounds like from that Instagram post that's sort of what Dana was accusing him of. And then it's switched because suddenly Monster Energy gives the UFC money. And so now he likes Hans Molenkamp. And it's just bad. And it was a little bit funny just when Cruz was actually giving his post-fight interview, because you could tell that Joe Rogan had no idea what was happening, because he didn't shut it down quick enough. Like, he was like, a charity fight? Yeah, like, what? Who are you talking about? Like, what's going on? Like, and then when he realized, or someone was talking into his ear, like, oh, like, sorry, you had to get political. Like, and then when Cruz said, oh, it's not political, we're talking about Monster, and then it just cuts. Like, you tell that just no one had any idea what Cruz was talking about until he had already said the things that he had said. And then they were like, God damn it. Because they would have cut him off like immediately.
Cruz has had some goofy interviews leading up to this fight, especially like about Keith Peterson and stuff. But this, at first I was confused too until I started Googling and then realized, no, this is like the best thing Cruz has said in a long time, to come out and talk about the predatory nature. I think the UFC was unhappy because if you point a finger at Monster or this guy, then you also have to point a finger at UFC for their predatory practices. And so it's like one predator protecting another predator. It's like how abusers protect other abusers. This was good on Dominick Cruz, and good thing Joe Rogan's so incompetent that he didn't stop this sooner. He'll interview a concussed man. He don't care. He'll just interview anybody. So, new guy?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I was about to say is, the reason Dana White is protecting Hans Molenkamp, whether he likes him on a personal level or not, is just he recognizes that he kind of does the same thing to fighters. Dana White runs an MMA promotion, but then gets mad at MMA fighters when they don't spend a significant amount of time promoting themselves or promoting their fight. And it's like, dude, that's the job of the promotion. And there's a lot of pressure. I mean, obviously it's a good idea from a career level to promote yourself using social media and stuff. But there's so much pressure for these fighters to just basically to run their own social media marketing company for themselves. And then you add on to the fact that you have guys like Hans Molenkamp who are basically, embezzling the social capital of their company, just for their own personal gain, and doing all these like silly stunts with professional MMA fighters on Instagram. It was kind of an amazing thing for Dominick Cruz to point out. And we were talking earlier about how Dominick Cruz is sort of at this point in his career where he knows he's not going to go on another title run. He probably knows it's like, he can certainly still compete with people like Casey Kenny, but he's probably not going to like reach the absolute height of that division again. So it kind of seems like it makes sense that now he's choosing this time to talk about these kinds of things, because this is the kind of things that, if let's say if Casey Kenny won and he said the same thing, that could really hurt his career. But Dominick Cruz is just sort of in a point, maybe he's at a point, maybe not, where he feels like it's worth it to take that risk and call out these kinds of practices. So good for Dom. It was a nice thing to hear.
Alexander, I know you got thoughts.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting hearing Dana's comments at the end, because one of the things he said that sponsorships are a privilege and not a right. which which is really messed up in the sense that he told on himself without realizing that he was telling on himself. Because in the UFC, sponsorships are a privilege as opposed to being a meritocracy, where if you are good enough to where you get enough eyes on you to where someone says we want to sponsor you, that they go ahead and sponsor you. You know what I'm saying? It's not like that, unfortunately. And instead is, are you buddy with the UFC? Do you show up and do all the press conferences? Then congratulations. Here's some sponsorships. Here's a little monster sticker on your tights.
Oh, that makes sense because in Dominick Cruz complaining about Monster, he's also basically saying that I'm only allowed to have Monster as one of the few sponsors that the UFC allows. Then really ultimately this is about the UFC because he can't say I don't want Monster sponsorship because then what sponsor is he going to get? UFC won't let you get another sponsor.
Exactly. It doesn't exist in a vacuum.
So ultimately this is really about the predatory practices of the UFC, and this is probably like the most labor-oriented topic of this whole UFC card. And really, fighters are workers, right? They are combat sports workers. And there's this surplus value being created off of their labor, and they get a very, very small cut of it. They're not even allowed to control how they make income. The UFC tells them who's allowed to give them extra income, right? Monster, previously it was Reebok. They are some of the most exploited workers.
Good old ANCAP MMA.
That about wraps it up. So this was a fun panel as usual. Karyan, where can people find you, and do you have anything to plug?
You can find me at Power Tools on Twitter, and yeah, I actually do have something to plug. I'm about to be releasing an article on Kevin Holland pretty much, I think next week is when I plan to get that taken care of and out. But thanks a lot for having me on. This has been really fun, and it's good to have a little room to come into and yell about Joe Rogan and Dana White into.
Alexander, where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at I Made This to Stan. I'm trying to be more active on there. I'm really bad about posting on Twitter, but I'm trying to get more active on Twitter. As far as things that are coming out, nothing that I can announce just yet. I do have some things, but like stay tuned. And I have some things coming out.
New guy?
You can find me on the Southpaw Patreon only Discord.
New guy is behind a paywall.
Yes.
You want to talk to new guy, you got to pay. You got to become a monthly subscriber.
It's true. This content ain't free.
Yeah, he's premium content only.
Not like the rest of us.
Aaron?
I don't have anything to plug. You can find me on Twitter at whatamieven. I'm kind of boring on there, but that's where you can find me.
All right, then I will put everybody's handles on the show notes.
Now that's the show. If you enjoyed this episode and find this type of independent media worthwhile, please consider supporting the show on Patreon. We have a lot more episodes like this one in the works, but need your financial support to keep the show running. Even a few dollars a month goes a long way. No one does what we do, and it's all being funded by you, the listener. In return for supporting us, you'll gain access to lots of bonus content along with our private Discord chat. Even if you can't support us, there's a lot of free bonus content there as well. We also have an online store if you want to show your Southpaw solidarity by wearing our swag. You can find all pertinent links at southpawpod.com. And if you can't afford to support the show and still want to help, please leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen. This makes it easier for others to find us. And don't forget to share your favorite episodes or the podcast itself on social media. Tell your friends. Until next time, goodbye.
Southpaw. Hitting with the left. Southpaw. Sam. Paul. Southpaw. Southpaw.